The dust of the sale yard settled on every surface, a fine red powder that clung to sweat and denim and the cracked hides of the animals waiting in their pens. It was the dust of defeat for most, the leavings of cattle sold for less than they were worth, but for Finn, it was just the air he had to breathe to be there. He stood by the rails of the boneyard pen, his hands resting on the rough-hewn wood, his stillness a stark contrast to the nervous energy of the auctioneer and the shifting weight of the men around him. Inside the pen were 19 head of cattle, a collection of ribs and hips so sharp you could hang a hat on them, their heads low, their eyes dull with the resignation of the condemned. They were the leftovers, the lot nobody wanted, swept up from failed homesteads and drought-starved pastures, destined for the cannery at a price that barely covered the paperwork. The auctioneer, a man named Henderson whose voice could curdle milk, was trying to work up some enthusiasm for the lot, but even he knew it was a lost cause. "All right, boys, who'll give me $1 a head for the lot?" $1? Take 'em home, feed 'em up, or send 'em on their final journey. $1 is all I'm asking." Henderson's voice boomed, but the crowd was silent, a collection of knowing smirks and slow headshakes. This was sport for them, the final humiliation of another man's failed dream, embodied in these skeletal beasts. It was Ward McCullough who spoke first, his voice carrying easily over the lowing of the other pens. Ward was a man who owned the best bottomland in the valley, a man whose cattle were fat and whose pronouncements were treated as gospel. "You'd be paying $1 to bury 'em, Henderson? Might as well ask for bids on 19 shovels." A wave of rough laughter rolled through the assembled ranchers. They were hard men in a hard land, and they saw no value in sentiment, only in beef and tallow. They saw 19 problems, 19 mouths that would eat what little grass was left before the real dry spell hit. Finn felt their certainty like a physical pressure, the weight of their collective wisdom pressing down on him. He had known this would happen. He had stood here and listened to them for an hour, watched them bid on prime stock, their confidence as broad as their hat brims. He waited until the laughter died down, until Henderson was about to wave the lot off as a loss. Then, his voice quiet but clear in the sudden lull, he said, $2. A silence fell over the yard, deeper than before. Heads turned. Ward McCullough turned his whole body, a slow, deliberate movement, a grin spreading across his face. He looked Finn up and down, taking in the worn boots, the mended shirt, the quiet set of his jaw. He was looking at the son of a man who had failed on a patch of high ground nobody else had ever wanted, a man who had come back to claim it after years away. "Well, look what we have here," Ward announced to the crowd. Finn Shepherd, back from wherever he's been, ready to throw good money after bad. Just like his old man, more laughter, sharper this time. "What are you gonna do with those ghosts, Finn? Stare 'em to death?" Finn didn't look at Ward. He kept his eyes on the auctioneer. $2 a head, he repeated, his voice flat, offering no defense, no explanation. It was a statement of fact, not an argument. Henderson, surprised but eager to close the sale, slammed his gavel down. "Sold. To Finn Shepherd, for $2 a head." "May God have mercy on your soul, son." The men around him slapped Ward on the back, their jokes following Finn as he walked toward the office to settle his account. He could hear them laying bets on how many of the 19 would see the first snow. He paid the clerk with the last of the money his father had left him, the paper thin and worn in his hands. He didn't feel their mockery as an insult, he felt it as a condition of the air, like the dust, something to be endured on the way to the work that needed doing. He just had to get them home. His father had believed in the same things Ward McCullough believed in, that good land was low land, that green grass was short grass, and that a fat calf was the only sign of success. He had spent 30 years trying to force that belief onto the 80 acres of high, rocky pasture he'd inherited, a place the old-timers called the Stone Orchard he had plowed the native grasses under, planting clover and timothy that withered every August. He had run heavy, thick-hided cattle that stripped the soft growth bare and then stood bawling with hunger by the fence, their hooves turning the thin topsoil to powder. Finn had grown up watching the struggle, a silent war between his father's certainty and the land's stubborn reality. He had watched the soil wash away in the spring rains and blow away in the dry autumn winds. He had tried to talk to his father once, when he was 17, pointing out how the wild bunchgrass on their neighbor's untouched quarter section held the earth in place, how the deer seemed to thrive on it. His father had boxed his ears for his insolence. "That's weeds, boy," he had roared. "We're ranchers, not goat herders." So Finn had left. He went north, working on outfits that ran cattle in the high desert, places where water was a memory and the forage was sparse and sharp. He learned to read the land not for what he wanted it to be, but for what it was. He learned from old men who spoke of a time before the big herds, a time when the cattle were leaner, tougher, with longer legs and a different kind of sense. They knew how to browse on bitterbrush and dig for the roots of hardy forbs. They were animals that belonged to a place, not just grazed upon it. He learned to see the subtle signs of health in an animal that looked lean to a corn-fed eye, the clarity of the eye, the suppleness of the hide, the way it moved across broken ground. He came back 5 years later for his father's funeral, returning to a homestead that was more dust than soil, the fences sagging, the barn leaning into the prevailing wind. The stone orchard had won. His father had died angry and defeated, his heart giving out as he tried to haul water to a dying herd. Finn buried him on the ridge overlooking the valley, then spent a year just walking the 80 acres, watching, listening, letting the place tell him what it needed. It was during that year he got to know Alma, the old woman on the neighboring quarter section. Her land was even poorer than his, yet she persisted. She was his father's age, a widow for 30 years, and the valley consensus was that she was half-mad, a recluse who kept a few ranger-looking animals that nobody would ever buy. Finn started stopping by, at first just to check that she had enough firewood cut for winter. She would meet him at the door, her eyes sharp in a face as wrinkled as a dried apple, and they would stand in silence for a long time before she would nod him inside for a cup of chicory coffee. She rarely spoke more than a few sentences at a time, but what she said had the weight of stone. One afternoon, watching her odd-looking cattle graze on the steep, brushy hillside, he asked her about them. "They're not much for market," he'd said, trying to be gentle. She had looked at him for a long moment, then out at her land. "Market wants fat," she said, her voice raspy with disuse. "The land wants survivors. You have to choose which one you're working for." It was she who told him about the old bloodlines, the ones they called Criollo, brought by the Spanish centuries before, animals that had adapted to this very landscape. They were bony and tough, and they knew how to eat what the land offered, not what a man planted. "They remember the old ways," she'd said, a phrase that stuck in his mind. When he heard about the boneyard lot at the auction, he knew what he had to do. He wasn't buying cattle. He was buying a memory. The walk home from the sale yard was a slow, grim procession that took the better part of 2 days. The 19 cows were weak, their hooves cracked, and they shambled along the dusty track more like ghosts than living animals. Finn moved around them on foot, his presence quiet and constant, never pushing them too hard, letting them stop to lip at the dry roadside weeds. He passed Ward McCullough's place, a green jewel of irrigated pasture stretching down to the river, dotted with thick, heavy-bodied cattle that lay in the shade of cottonwoods, chewing their cud. Ward was on his porch and watched them pass, not even bothering to wave. The message was clear: this is what success looks like, and you, with your parade of skeletons, are its opposite. Finn kept walking, his eyes on the high, pale line of his own ridge in the distance. He felt no envy, only a quiet resolve. Ward's land was a testament to the power of water and money. His own would have to be a testament to something else. When they finally reached his gate, the cattle were near exhaustion. He led them into the main pasture, the 40 acres on the north slope. To a conventional eye, it was poor stuff. The ground was rocky, and instead of a uniform carpet of green, it was a mosaic of different plants, tall, golden bunchgrasses, silver-green sagebrush, tough-looking shrubs he was only just learning the names for. It was the land his father had despised, the land he'd tried and failed to tame. The cows, instead of collapsing, began to move. They spread out, not grazing in a tight herd but individually, their heads down. They ignored the few patches of softer grass and went straight for the rougher forage, the stuff his father had called weeds. They tore at the seed heads of the bunchgrass and used their noses to push aside rocks to get at the roots of a purple-flowered plant Alma had called prairie clover. Finn stood at the fence for an hour, watching. They were not just eating, they were seeking, selecting, using an intelligence he was only beginning to understand. His work began not with the animals, but with the land that held them. He spent the spring and early summer walking his fence lines, not just repairing them, but rethinking them. His father had run one large pasture, forcing the cattle to graze it down to the nub. Finn began dividing the 80 acres into smaller paddocks, using single strands of salvaged wire strung between juniper posts he cut from the canyons. The plan was to move the cattle frequently, to give the land time to recover after they had passed through, a practice he had seen work in the high desert. It was slow, back-breaking work. He dug post holes in the rocky soil with a hand auger, his shoulders and back screaming in protest. He found an old spring his father had ignored, choked with cattails and mud. He spent a week digging it out by hand, lining it with flat stones until the water ran clear and cool into a shallow basin. This would be their water, reliable and deep, not a surface creek that would dry up by August. One evening, he walked over to Alma's. He found her sitting on her porch, watching the sun set. He told her what he was doing, about the fences, the spring. She listened without comment, her eyes on the distant mountains. When he finished, she was silent for a time. Then she said, "The land breathes. You're just giving it room to take a breath." She gave him a small, cloth-wrapped bundle of seeds from a tough, deep-rooted grass she called deer tongue. "Put this where the ground is barest," she said. "It holds on." The general store in the town of Redemption was the valley's social hub, a place where news and gossip were traded as currency alongside flour and coffee. When Finn went in for supplies in midsummer, the air was thick with the slow drawl of conversation and the smell of dust and cured meats. Ward McCullough was there, of course, leaning against the counter, holding court. He was talking about the weather, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who had never been proven wrong. "It's gonna be a dry one," he declared, not to anyone in particular, but to the room at large. "Drier than last year. I can feel it in my bones. Anyone who hasn't got river access is going to be hauling water by September, and hauling feed by November." A few of the other ranchers nodded in agreement, their faces grim. They looked to Ward for the truth of things, and his truth was always simple and stark. The conversation turned to cattle prices, to the cost of hay, to the general hardship of their lives. It was a comfortable ritual of complaint and consensus. Finn gathered his things, a sack of beans, salt, a new handle for his axe, and kept to the edges of the room. He was aware of the glances in his direction, the way conversations quieted slightly when he passed. He was a living question mark in their world of declarative sentences. Mr. Davies, the storekeeper, a quiet man with kind eyes, tallied his purchases without a word. As Finn counted out his coins, Davies pushed a small bag of rock salt across the counter. "For the cattle," he said, his voice low. "On account. Pay me when you can." It was a small gesture, but in that room, it felt enormous. It was the first crack in the wall of their consensus. Finn just nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you, Mr. Davies." As he turned to leave, Ward's voice cut through the room again. "Still got all 19 of those scarecrows, Shepherd?" Finn stopped at the door but didn't turn around. "Yes," he said. "Good," Ward boomed. "Saves the coyotes the trouble of digging 'em up." The men laughed, and the sound followed Finn out into the blinding sun. He didn't let the anger take hold. It was useless energy. He loaded his supplies onto his pack mule and started the long walk home, focusing on the solid weight of the salt, a quiet promise from an unexpected ally. The laughter was just noise. The work was real. The heat arrived in August, not as a gentle warming, but as a physical presence, a weight that settled over the valley and did not lift. The sky turned a pale, hazy blue, and the sun beat down with a relentless, baking intensity. The river that fed Ward McCullough's pastures began to shrink, pulling away from its banks to reveal cracked mud flats. The lush green of his fields faded to a sickly yellow-brown, the clover crisping under the hooves of his heavy cattle. He started running his pump day and night, trying to flood the fields, but the water seemed to vanish into the air before it could sink into the soil. Down at the general store, the talk was of nothing but the drought. Men who had been confident in July were anxious in August, their faces tight with worry. They spoke of selling off their calves early, of culling their herds, of the spiraling cost of hay shipped in from greener lands to the east. The world they had built, a world predicated on abundant water and lush grass, was beginning to crumble at the edges. On Finn's 80 acres, the change was different. The land had never been green, so it did not turn brown. It simply grew quieter, more still. The native bunch grasses, which had been a vibrant gold, bleached to the color of bone, but they did not die. Their deep roots, 10, 15 feet long, were still drawing moisture from far below the surface, moisture the shallow-rooted clover could never reach. The sagebrush and bitterbrush seemed to thrive in the heat, their silvery leaves conserving every drop of water. Finn's 19 cows, now with a fine layer of flesh over their bones, changed their habits. They grazed in the cool of the early morning and late evening, and spent the heat of the day resting in the shade of the juniper brakes. They moved slowly, conserving energy. They ate the dried grasses, the tough leaves of the shrubs, even the prickly pear cactus, which they expertly rolled with their hooves to break off the spines. They were not fat, but they were healthy. Their coats shone, their eyes were clear. Finn would walk among them in the evenings, his hand resting on a flank here, a shoulder there. He felt the solid muscle beneath the hide. He would crumble the dry soil in his hands. It was dust on the surface, but a few inches down, it was still cool, held together by the intricate web of native roots his father had tried so hard to destroy. He was not winning a war against the drought. He was simply living within its terms, and his land, and the animals that knew it, were doing the same. He was beginning to understand what Alma meant. He was not working for the market. He was working for survival. The first snows came late that year, a light dusting that did little to quench the thirst of the land. The winter was cold and, worse, it was dry. The wind blew relentlessly out of the north, stripping any warmth from the sun and sucking the last of the moisture from the soil. In the valley, the situation grew dire. The river froze, but not before it had dwindled to a trickle. Ward McCullough's ponds were sheets of ice over beds of mud. He had sold off a third of his herd at a loss, but the cattle he kept were now entirely dependent on the hay he was forced to buy. Twice a week, a freight wagon loaded high with expensive alfalfa rumbled through town and up the road to Ward's ranch. The whole valley watched, and they saw the grim set of Ward's jaw as he paid the teamster. They saw his wealth, his certainty, draining away with every bale. The winter fulfilled the prophecy made at the auction yard, but not for the man they expected. Men were burying cattle all over the valley, animals that had starved or frozen, too weak to withstand the harshness of the season. But on Finn's ridge, all 19 of his cows were still standing. They were lean, their winter coats thick and shaggy, but they were alive. He had managed to scythe a small amount of the native grass before the first frost, and he rationed it carefully, supplementing their winter foraging. They spent their days on the south-facing slopes, out of the wind, browsing on the juniper and mountain mahogany that clung to the rocky outcrops. They remembered how to survive a winter like this. It was in their bones, a knowledge passed down through generations of ancestors who had never seen a bale of alfalfa. Finn spent the winter in his small cabin, mending harnesses and oiling his saddle, the quiet rhythms of the work a comfort against the howling wind. He saw Alma once a week. He would bring her a rabbit he'd snared or a bit of his salted meat. She was growing frail, the cold seeping into her bones. She rarely left her chair by the stove. One afternoon, as they sat in silence, she looked at him, her eyes still sharp. "The land always culls," she said, her voice a dry whisper. "It takes the proud ones first. The ones who think they can command it. It rewards the patient." Her words felt like a final accounting, a summary of a life spent in observation. As he left that day, walking back across the frozen ground under a sky the color of slate, he thought about her words. He wasn't patient. He was just watching, and listening, and trying to learn the land's language. The winter was a hard teacher, but its lessons were clear. When spring arrived, it brought no relief. The snow melted away to reveal the same parched earth. The sky remained a stubborn, cloudless blue. The drought, which had been a hardship, was now becoming a catastrophe. The creeks that usually ran full with snowmelt were nothing more than damp stains on the ground. The valley's mood soured from anxiety to despair. More cattle were sold, good breeding stock let go for a pittance, animals that represented years of work and hope. The sound of Ward McCullough's water pump, once a symbol of his prosperity, fell silent. The river was too low to draw from. His prized fields were now expanses of cracked, barren earth. The social order of the valley began to fray. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a sullen, fearful silence. The mockery that had followed Finn had vanished. No one made jokes about his boneyard cattle anymore. Instead, they watched him. When he rode to town, men would stop their conversations and follow him with their eyes. He had become a mystery. Rumors circulated that he had found a secret spring, that he had some kind of magic. The truth was far simpler, and therefore harder for them to grasp. His land was holding. The native grasses, rested and rotated, sent up new, green shoots from their deep roots. His 19 cows, impossibly, were all nursing healthy, vigorous calves. They were smaller than the calves in the valley, but they were tough and quick on their feet. One morning, as Finn was checking the fence line that bordered his neighbor's property, the neighbor himself, a man named Peters who had laughed with the rest of them at the auction, rode up. He sat on his horse for a long time, just looking from his own bare pasture to the sparse but living cover on Finn's side of the wire. "Morning, Finn," he finally said, his voice hesitant. "Morning, Mr. Peters, your grass." Peters started, then trailed off, unsure how to ask the question. Finn waited. "How is it you still have grass?" Finn looked out over his land, at the cattle grazing peacefully on the slope. He thought of Alma's words, of the long nights spent reading the old books on animal husbandry he'd found in his father's dusty study, of the simple, hard work of the past year. "I suppose I have the right kind of cattle for the wrong kind of grass," Finn said. It was the simplest explanation he could offer. Peters just nodded slowly, his eyes full of a dawning, difficult understanding. "I suppose you do," he said, and rode away. The quiet admission was worth more than 1,000 apologies. In the fall of the second year of the drought, Alma died. She passed in her sleep, as quietly as she had lived. Finn found her, sitting in her chair by the cold stove, a blanket pulled over her lap, looking out the window toward the mountains. The whole valley turned out for her burial, a surprising show of respect for the woman they had mostly ignored. They spoke of her toughness, her endurance, as if they were qualities they had always admired. Finn said nothing. He stood at the back of the small crowd, his hat in his hands, feeling the loss not as a sharp pain but as a great, hollow silence in the world. Her nephew came from the city to settle her affairs, a man in a clean suit who wanted nothing to do with the place. He hired Finn to round up her few remaining cattle and see to the disposition of the homestead. While cleaning out her small cabin, Finn found her notebooks. There were a dozen of them, stacked in a wooden box under her bed, their pages filled with a fine, spidery script. They were records of her life, but not of her feelings. They were records of the land. Decades of observations, when the first frost came each year, which grasses stayed green the longest, when the migrating birds arrived, how deep the snow was on the north-facing slopes. It was a lifetime of paying attention. Tucked into the last notebook was a packet of deer tongue grass seeds, just like the one she had given him. He slipped it into his pocket. This was her true legacy, this quiet accumulation of knowledge. A young man named Matteo, who had done odd jobs for Alma in her final years, helped Finn with the work. Matteo was quiet, like Finn, with watchful eyes. He understood what Alma had been doing. "She always said the land tells you what it needs," Matteo said one afternoon, as they were repairing a section of her fence. Most folks are too busy shouting at it to listen. In that moment, Finn saw the line of succession. The knowledge hadn't died with Alma. It had been passed to him, and now, here was someone else who was ready to listen. He offered Matteo a job. The boy accepted with a simple nod. The legacy loop was complete. The wisdom had found its next vessel. The third year of the drought was no longer called a drought. It was just the way things were. The landscape of the valley had been permanently altered. Ranches that had been in families for generations were sold off, their owners defeated, moving on to greener pastures that likely no longer existed. Ward McCullough held on, but just barely. His herd was a fraction of its former size, his fields were a dust bowl, and the lines of worry on his face had become permanent fixtures. His certainty had been baked out of him by 3 years of a relentless sun. One afternoon, Finn and Matteo were moving their small herd to a fresh paddock on the ridge that overlooked Ward's property. The contrast was brutal. On their side of the fence, there was sparse but resilient cover, the earth held in place by the tenacious roots of the native plants. On Ward's side, there was nothing but bare, cracked dirt, blowing in the wind. Ward was there, standing by the fence, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders slumped. He watched them for a long time, his face unreadable. Finn gave Matteo instructions to settle the herd, then walked slowly toward the fence line. He and Ward stood on opposite sides of the wire, a tangible representation of their two different worlds. For a long time, neither man spoke. The only sound was the wind and the distant lowing of Finn's cattle. Finally, Ward spoke, his voice rough, stripped of its old, booming confidence. It was not an apology. It was not a confession. It was a question, direct and unadorned. How? Finn looked not at Ward, but at the land. He looked at the way the bunch grass grew, leaving space between each plant for the scarce rainfall. He looked at his cattle, who were browsing on the tough leaves of a saltbush, not just grazing. He thought of Alma's notebooks, of the generations of knowledge held in the instincts of his animals. He didn't have a simple answer, because it wasn't a simple thing. It was a way of seeing. You look at your land and see what you can take from it, Finn said, his voice even. I had to learn to look at mine and see what it was willing to give. He pointed with his chin toward one of his cows. Those animals know how to ask. Your animals forgot. Ward followed his gaze. He looked at Finn's lean, hardy cattle, then back at his own barren land. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just nodded, a slow, tired acknowledgement of a truth he could no longer deny. The conversion was quiet, without fanfare, a private surrender witnessed only by the wind and the dust. He turned and walked back toward his house, a man whose world had been undone not by a storm or a fire, but by a quiet man and 19 bony cows. For years after he had stood in the dust of the sale yard and endured the mockery of his neighbors, Finn was back. He stood in the same spot by the rails, but the world had turned. The drought had broken the previous spring, but it had left its mark on the land and on the people. They were quieter now, less certain. They knew how quickly everything could be lost. Today, Finn was not buying, he was selling. In the main auction pen, under the critical eyes of the valley's ranchers, stood 5 of his young bulls. They were descendants of the original 19, born and raised on the high, rocky pastures of the stone orchard. They were not heavy like the bulls Ward McCullough had once sold. They were lean, athletic, with long legs and a wild, intelligent look in their eyes. They were built for survival. Henderson, the auctioneer, started the bidding. What am I bid for this fine lot of shepherd bulls? Animals born to this country, bulls that know how to live on what the land gives you. His patter had changed. He was no longer selling fat, he was selling resilience. The bidding started, hesitant at first. These were not the animals these men were used to buying. They were an investment in a different kind of future. Then, a new voice joined the bidding, quiet but firm. It was Ward McCullough. He stood in the crowd, no longer at the center, just one of many. He didn't look at Finn. He kept his eyes on the bulls. He bid, and then he bid again, his voice steady. The price climbed. The other bidders fell away, leaving only Ward. A hush fell over the yard. Everyone watched, understanding the weight of the moment. Henderson's gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed in the silence. Sold. To Ward McCullough. Ward walked to the office to settle his account, his step measured, his face calm. He was not the same man he had been 4 years ago. The land had humbled him. Finn watched him go, then turned his gaze back to the empty pen. The dust settled. The work was not over, but something had been proven. He had not set out to teach anyone a lesson, only to survive. But in doing so, he had shown them another way. The circle was complete. The thing they had mocked had become the thing they needed.